Former NBA player and wellness advocate Jarnell Stokes is the owner of Stokes Superfoods. Stokes Superfoods brings the purest form and highest quality products to those who want to turn the tables and take responsibility for their health. Educate people on the power of returning to nature and the holistic inner self. Our products cannot heal any disease alone, but we're here to assist in the healing process for both the mind and body. Stokes Superfoods are highly recommended. For more information, please click on the link in my description box below.
Today, there's a new epidemic, smokable cocaine, otherwise known as crack. It is an explosively destructive and often lethal substance which is crushing its users. It is an uncontrolled fire. As we mobilize for this national crusade, I'm mindful that drugs are a constant temptation for millions. Please remember this when your courage is tested. You are Americans. You're the product of the freest society mankind has ever known. No one ever has the right to destroy your dreams and shatter your life.
In September of '86, with the media frenzy at full throttle, the House passed legislation that allocated $2 billion to the anti-drug crusade. $2 billion. They required the participation of the military in narcotics control efforts to allow the death penalty for some drug-related crimes and authorize admissions of illegally obtained evidence in drug raids. Later that month, the Senate proposed an even tougher anti-drug legislation, and shortly thereafter, the President signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of '86.
The mammoth omnibus drug bill passed both houses of Congress with an overwhelming majority. Federal sentences for marijuana, heroin, and cocaine were unprecedented in their severity. Federal parole in most drug cases was eliminated. What began as alarm over the crack epidemic had mushroomed into a program requiring the incarceration of tens of thousands. Among the sweeping changes proposed was a new law mandating minimum sentences for federal drug convictions, eliminating a judge's discretion in pronouncing sentence.
Members in our subcommittee, the crime subcommittee, said, look, we want mandatory minimums. We want higher level penalties. And at the end of really this 3 or 4 week little period, suddenly this was literally on the table without a hearing, without any really preparation.
There was not a lot of study. There was a call for action in Congress. There was talk about, the way the normal legislative process runs. They do full-scale hearings and they bring experts in and they do an awful lot of investigation. Well, that didn't happen with crack cocaine in particular.
In record time, Congress rewrote virtually all the nation's drug laws. A get-tough crackdown unparalleled in drug war history. Measures included, from the crime subcommittee, the death penalty for major traffickers, life in prison for some repeat offenders, more severe federal penalties for simple possession. From the Armed Services Committee, for the first time, direct involvement of the U.S. military in interdiction. From the Committee on Merchant Marine and Fisheries, stiff penalties for drugs found on any American boat. From the Judiciary Committee, federal penalties for money laundering and a new asset forfeiture law that allowed federal police agencies to keep the property they seized. From the Agriculture Committee, the arming of forest rangers.
The new Anti-Drug Abuse Act authorized public housing authorities to evict any tenant who allows any form of drug-related criminal activities on or near public housing premises. This act also affected student loans and expanded the death penalty. Also, included a 5-year mandatory minimum for simple possession of cocaine base with no evidence. They didn't have to have evidence to book you. Drug offenders face lifetime consequences for minor infractions. Yet the focus on tough sentences for crack and not powder cocaine meant that the people who were going to jail were black. The media seemed to play along, hyping up threats with racist coverage that largely ignored rampant cocaine use among whites. And it sensationalized the crack problem in inner city black communities.
The drug war became a national obsession.
There's an epidemic of the cocaine called crack.
It is epidemic and it can kill.
The crack problem has become a crack crisis and it's spreading nationwide.
This is Clements Avenue in Charleston, South Carolina.
Here in Bakersfield, city parks like this one have become favorite hangouts for drug dealers.
It's around Philadelphia's 8th and...
A few years after the war on drugs was declared, crack began to spread rapidly in poor communities of Los Angeles, and then later emerged in cities across the country. The Reagan administration hired staff to publicize the emergence of crack cocaine in 1985. This right here was part of a strategic effort to build public and legislative support for the war. During the crack era, a study of urban black fathers found that 28% actually had access to an automobile. That rate fell to 18% of those living in the ghetto. And with all these fathers being locked up, they was arresting all these brothers. This destroyed the black family. Kids growing up without a father are 5 times more likely to be poor, twice as likely to drop out of school or end up in foster care or juvenile justice facilities. A man by the name of Gary Webb has exposed what really happened and why it happened during the crack era.
Men who were working for the CIA's army were responsible for bringing all that cocaine into Los Angeles that sparked the crack epidemic.
The CIA's army, Webb says, were the Contras, the anti-communist rebels fighting the government of Nicaragua back in the 1980s. An army founded and funded by the CIA.
Webb wrote that some Contra supporters smuggled cocaine to America to raise money for their cause.
The CIA has been bringing drugs into this country.
As then
Gary
CIA
Webb
Director
reported, in addition to waging a proxy war for the U.S. government against Nicaragua's revolutionary government in the 1980s, elements of the CIA backed Contra rebels who were involved in trafficking cocaine into the U.S. This was in order to fund their counter-revolutionary campaign. The secret flow of drugs and money, Webb reported, had a direct link to the subsequent explosion of crack cocaine, the abuse that devastated California's most vulnerable black neighborhoods. The transformation from community policing to military policing began in 1981. This was when President Reagan persuaded Congress to pass the Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act. This act encouraged the military to give local, state, and federal police access to military bases. Also, intelligence, weaponry, equipment, all for drug interdiction. Fast forward today, during this opioid crisis, Congress put out a statement saying that they want to focus more on the treatment instead of their incarceration. There's over 50,000 deaths per year, with the vast majority of those deaths being white people. They want to call this an epidemic or a crisis. And now there is no more war on drugs. And Congress spent millions of dollars on treatment facilities. But during the crack era, They locked everybody up, and they left us for dead. You have brothers who are still locked up to this day from the 80s crack era. Right now, still locked up. During the crack era, they came down hard on black folks, while white powder cocaine users got slaps on the wrist. Thousands and thousands and thousands of brothers were locked up, while white people from the suburbs got a pass.
If you ask the question, why are some drugs legal and others illegal? Why are cigarettes and alcohol legal and pharmaceuticals in the middle and these other drugs, marijuana, other ones illegal? Some people sort of inherently assume, well, this must be because there was a thoughtful consideration of the relative risks of drugs, and but then you think, well, that can't be, because we know alcohol is more associated with violence than almost any illegal drugs, and cigarettes are more addictive than any of the illegal drugs. I mean, heroin addicts routinely say it's harder to quit cigarettes than it is to quit heroin. So it's not as if there was ever any kind of National Academy of Science that 100 years ago decided that these drugs, these ones had to be illegal and those ones legal. And it's not as if this is in the Bible or in the Code of Hammurabi. I mean, nobody was making legal distinctions among many of these drugs until the 20th century, essentially. So if you ask how and why this distinction got made, what you realize when you look at the history is it has almost nothing to do with the relative risks of these drugs, and almost everything to do with who used and who was perceived to use these drugs, right? So there was, back in the 1870s, when the majority of opiate consumers were middle-aged white women, throughout the country, using them for their aches and pains and for their, when the time of the month and menopause, and there was no aspirin, there was no penicillin, lots of diarrhea because of bad sanitation, and nothing stops you up like opiates. I mean, millions, many more, much higher percentage of the population back then used opiates than now, but nobody thought about criminalizing it because nobody wanted to put, auntie or grandma behind bars, right? But then when the Chinese start coming to the country in large numbers in the 1870s and 80s and, working on the railroads and working in the mines and working in factories and and then going back home at the end of the night to smoke up a little opium the way they did in the old country, the same way white people were having a couple of whiskeys in the evening. And that's when you got the first opium prohibition laws in Nevada, in California, in the 1870s and 80s, directed at the Chinese minorities. It was all about the fear, what would those Chinamen with their opium do to our precious women, addicting them and seducing them and turning them into sex slaves and all this sort of stuff. The first anti-cocaine laws were in the South in the early part of the 20th century, directed at black men working on the docks, and the fear, what would happen to those black men when they took that white powder up their black noses and forgot their proper place in society, going out. First time anybody ever said that, cops needed a 38 would not bring down a Negro crazed on cocaine, you needed a 45. I mean, the New York Times, the paper of record reporting this stuff as fact back in those days. That's when you got the first cocaine prohibition laws. The first marijuana prohibition laws were in the Midwest and the Southwest, directed at Mexican migrants, Mexican Americans, taking the good jobs from the good white people, going back home to their communities, smoking a little of that funny smoking, marijuana, reefer, cigarette. And once again, the fear, what would this minority do to our precious women and children? So, it's always been about that.
Please follow the History with No Chaser Facebook page and Instagram page. Thanks for watching. Make sure you hit the thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe. And let me know what you think in the comment section.